Part 1. Static. The radio tower stood against the November sky like a skeletal finger pointing accusations at the heavens. Thomas Brennan had driven past it 1,000 times during his commute to the university, but tonight marked the first time he would enter its rusted gates. The job posting had been cryptic, almost absurdly so for the digital age. A handwritten note tacked to the bulletin board in the communications building, seeking a late-night radio operator for WKNT, a station Thomas had never heard of despite living in the area for 3 years. The gate groaned as he pushed it open, the sound carrying across the empty field that surrounded the tower. Dead grass crunched beneath his shoes, and the November wind cut through his jacket with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Thomas clutched the piece of paper with the address and the time scrawled in fading ink. Midnight. He checked his phone. 11:53. The building at the tower's base was smaller than he expected. A squat concrete structure that seemed to have been designed during an era when aesthetics took a distant second place to function. A single light burned above the door, attracting a swarm of moths that danced their ancient feudal dance. Thomas raised his hand to knock but found the door already ajar, swinging open at his touch to reveal a narrow corridor lit by fluorescent bulbs that hummed with electrical anxiety. The hallway smelled of old paper and something else, something organic and faintly sweet that Thomas couldn't quite identify. He followed the corridor deeper into the building, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. At the end of the hall, another door stood open, and through it, he could see the radio booth. The equipment was anachronistic, a museum piece of dials and switches and vacuum tubes that glowed with amber light. A single microphone stood on the desk like a chrome monument, and behind it sat an empty chair. The walls were lined with shelves holding records, actual vinyl records in paper sleeves, organized with obsessive precision. A single window looked out onto the field and the tower beyond, though the glass was so thick with grime that the view seemed more like an impressionist painting than reality. Thomas entered the booth and sat in the chair, which adjusted to his weight with a pneumatic sigh. The equipment was already on, the needles on the various meters bouncing and swaying to some invisible rhythm. A laminated card lay on the desk, typed instructions that had yellowed with age. Simple enough, Thomas thought. A graveyard shift playing old records for insomniacs and truck drivers. The pay was generous, absurdly so for what amounted to babysitting obsolete equipment, but Thomas was in no position to question good fortune. His teaching assistantship barely covered rent, and the mysterious benefactor who posted the job had offered cash, weekly, no questions asked. The clock on the wall clicked to midnight, and as if responding to some invisible cue, the equipment came fully alive. The meters jumped, the speakers hissed with white noise, and Thomas found himself reaching for the microphone before he consciously decided to move. His hand wrapped around the cool metal, and he felt a slight tingling sensation, like touching a battery with his tongue. He pulled back, startled, and the sensation faded. Just static electricity, he reasoned. Old equipment in a dry building, nothing more. He reached for the microphone again, this time prepared for the sensation, and lifted it from its stand. The first record was already cued, waiting on the turntable like a patient animal. Thomas didn't remember selecting it, didn't remember even looking at the collection. But there it was, a black disc in a sleeve with no label, no indication of artist or title. He placed it on the turntable and set the needle with the careful precision of someone who had grown up in the CD age and treated vinyl with the reverence usually reserved for archaeological artifacts. The music that emerged from the speakers was unlike anything Thomas had heard before. It wasn't quite jazz, wasn't quite classical, existed in some liminal space between genres that perhaps had never been named. The melody was haunting, built on intervals that seemed mathematically impossible, and underneath it ran a rhythm that matched exactly the beating of his heart. He let the record play, watching the needle trace its spiral path toward the center. Outside the window, the tower rose into the darkness, its red warning lights blinking with metronomic precision. The moths continued their dance around the doorlight, and somewhere in the building, Water dripped with the patience of geology. The record ended, and Thomas reached for another. This one had a label, though the text was in a language he didn't recognize. Symbols that looked almost like Arabic but weren't. Characters that seemed to shift slightly when he wasn't looking directly at them. He played it anyway, and the music that emerged was different, but somehow the same, built on those same impossible intervals, that same heart-matching rhythm. The night progressed in a blur of records and music that Thomas would later struggle to remember. Each disc was different, each song unique, but they all shared that quality of wrongness, of existing slightly outside the normal bounds of musical theory. He lost track of time, lost himself in the hypnotic repetition of selecting, placing, playing, removing, replacing. The red phone rang at 3:37. Thomas stared at it for 3 rings before he remembered the instructions. Monitor the red phone for incoming calls. He lifted the receiver, an old-fashioned handset that weighed more than his smartphone, and held it to his ear. Breathing. Just breathing, slow and steady and somehow wet, like someone breathing through damaged lungs. Thomas waited for words, for some indication of why someone would call a radio station at 3:37 in the morning just to breathe into the phone, but no words came. Just the breathing, in and out, matching the rhythm of the music still playing from the speakers. He hung up after 30 seconds, and the phone didn't ring again. At 6 a.m., precisely as the instructions indicated, the equipment began to power down. The meters dropped, the tubes dimmed, and the speakers fell silent. Thomas sat in the chair, suddenly exhausted, as if he had run a marathon rather than simply playing records for 6 hours. His hands trembled slightly, and his mouth was dry, desperately dry, though he didn't remember feeling thirsty during the broadcast. He left the building as the sun began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The drive home was a blur, and he fell into bed fully clothed, plunging into a sleep so deep it resembled death. Part 2, Resonance. Thomas returned to the tower the following night, and the night after that, and the night after that. The work fell into a pattern, a routine that became as natural as breathing. Arrive at midnight, enter the booth, play the records, monitor the phone, leave at dawn. The pay appeared in his apartment mailbox every Monday, crisp $100 bills in an envelope with no return address. He tried to research the station during his waking hours, but found nothing. No FCC license, no broadcast history, no mention in any database or archive. WKNT didn't exist in any official capacity, yet every night he sat in that booth and sent music out into the darkness. And somewhere, someone must have been listening. The calls became more frequent, always on the red phone, always between 3 and 4 a.m., always just breathing. Thomas began to recognize subtle variations in the pattern. Sometimes the breathing was quick and shallow, sometimes slow and deep. Sometimes he heard other sounds in the background, wind or water, or something that might have been whispered words in that same unidentifiable language from the record labels. 3 weeks into his tenure at WKNT, Thomas began to notice changes in himself. He needed less sleep, for one thing. Where before he would crash after his shift and sleep until mid-afternoon, now he found himself waking after only 4 or 5 hours, feeling refreshed and alert. His skin took on a pale quality that concerned his colleagues at the university, and his students began to comment that he looked different, though none could articulate exactly how. Food lost its appeal. He ate because he knew he should, because his body required fuel, but nothing tasted right anymore. Everything was bland, muted, as if his taste buds had been wrapped in cotton. Only red wine retained any flavor, and he found himself drinking more of it than was probably advisable, savoring the way it coated his tongue and throat with something that approached the intensity he remembered from food. His research at the university suffered. His dissertation on early radio technology in rural America, once his passion, now seemed trivial and pointless. He found himself distracted during lectures, his mind wandering back to the tower, to the records, to that music that shouldn't exist, but did. His advisor called him into her office to express concern, but her words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through layers of static. The fourth week, Thomas arrived at the tower to find the door already open and someone sitting in his chair. She was pale, impossibly pale, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders like a curtain of night. She wore a dress that might have been fashionable in the 1920s, or might have been designed yesterday. Time seemed to have no meaning in her choice of clothing. She turned as Thomas entered, and her eyes caught the amber light from the equipment tubes, reflecting it back in a way that human eyes shouldn't. She gestured to a second chair that Thomas was certain hadn't been there before, and he sat without thinking, without choosing to sit, his body responding to her unspoken command. She turned back to the equipment, selected a record, and placed it on the turntable with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. The music that emerged was different from anything Thomas had played. It was darker, richer, built on harmonies that made his bones ache and his teeth hurt. The rhythm no longer matched his heartbeat. Instead, it seemed to be trying to alter it, to slow it down to match some other tempo. The woman spoke finely, her voice like silk dragged across broken glass. Her words weren't in English, weren't in any language Thomas recognized, but somehow he understood them anyway. She was explaining the tower, the station, the purpose of the midnight broadcast. The music was a signal, she said without saying, a beacon that called to those who could hear it. Not everyone could. Most humans lacked the necessary sensitivity, their souls too coarse to perceive the frequencies. But some could, some did, and they came when called. She told him about the history of the station, about the man who built it in 1927, about the pact he made with things that existed in the spaces between radio waves. She told him about the previous operators, all 17 of them, and what became of each when they proved unsuitable or unwilling to continue the work. And she told him about the music itself, about how it was composed by entities that experienced time differently than humans, that perceived reality in spectrums invisible to mortal eyes. The impossible intervals weren't impossible at all. They were simply borrowed from dimensions where the laws of physics bent in different directions. Thomas listened, understanding without comprehending, accepting without believing. When she finished speaking, she stood and moved to the door, pausing to look back at him with those light-reflecting eyes. She told him he was doing well, better than most, that his sensitivity to the frequencies was higher than average. She told him to continue the work, to play the records, to answer the phone. And she told him, in words that bypassed his ears and went straight to his brain, that he was changing, that the music was remaking him into something more suitable for the work ahead. Then she was gone, and Thomas was alone in the booth with the equipment and the endless collection of records. The clock showed 12:15. He had lost only 15 minutes, though the conversation had seemed to last for hours. He selected a record at random and placed it on the turntable, his hands moving with a confidence they hadn't possessed before. The music flowed from the speakers, and this time, Thomas could hear layers he had missed before. Beneath the melody, beneath the rhythm, there were voices singing in frequencies just below human hearing. Words and languages that predated language, melodies that had never been meant for human ears. The phone rang, and Thomas answered. The breathing was still there, but now he could hear the words hidden within it, syllables shaped by exhalation and inhalation. They were greetings, he realized. The callers were checking in, confirming their continued existence, maintaining their connection to the signal. Thomas began to respond, not with words, but with adjustments to the equipment. He found that by turning certain dials, by adjusting certain frequencies, he could modulate the signal in ways that the callers could perceive. He was having conversations, after a fashion, dialogues conducted entirely in electromagnetic pulses and frequency shifts. The night passed quickly after that, and when 6 a.m. arrived, Thomas felt disappointed rather than relieved. He wanted to continue, wanted to explore the depths of this new form of communication, but the equipment powered down according to its ancient schedule, and he was left sitting in silence as the sun rose outside. Part 3. Transformation. The changes accelerated after his encounter with the pale woman. Thomas's reflection in the mirror began to disturb him, not because it looked wrong, but because it looked increasingly right. His features were the same, his eyes the same shade of brown they had always been, his hair the same unruly dark curls. But there was something different in the way light fell across his face, in the way shadows pooled in the hollows of his cheeks. His students noticed. They began to avoid his office hours, and when they did come, they kept their visits brief, their eyes darting to the door as if planning escape routes. His colleagues stopped inviting him to lunch. The department secretary started to flinch when he approached her desk. No one said anything directly, but the message was clear. He had become something that made people uncomfortable on an instinctive level. Thomas tried to care but found that his emotional responses had become muted along with his sense of taste. Concern, anxiety, fear, these things existed at a distance now, like weather patterns observed from far away. He understood intellectually that his social isolation should bother him, but the understanding remained abstract, academic. What did bother him, what increasingly consumed his thoughts during the daylight hours, was the music. He couldn't get it out of his head. The impossible intervals played on repeat in his mind, and he found himself tapping out the rhythms on his desk during faculty meetings, humming the melodies while walking across campus. Other people would stop and stare when he did this, their faces registering something between confusion and alarm, and Thomas would realize that the sounds he was making didn't translate well to human vocal cords. He began to research the history of radio broadcasting, diving deeper than his dissertation had ever taken him. He learned about the early days, about the pioneers who had recognized that radio waves could carry more than just information. He found references, always vague and quickly retracted, to experiments in the 1920s and 30s that had tried to use radio frequencies to contact things that existed outside normal space and time. Most of these experiments had ended badly. Equipment destroyed, researchers driven mad, entire laboratories abandoned after incidents that were never fully explained in the surviving documents. But a very few, had succeeded in making contact. And of those, an even smaller number had managed to establish ongoing communication. WKNT was one of these successes, Thomas realized. The tower had been built specifically to maintain a channel between worlds, between states of being. The music was the carrier wave, the medium through which entities from elsewhere could touch the human world. And the operators, people like Thomas, were the translators, the living interfaces between incompatible realities. This understanding should have terrified him. A month ago, it would have sent him running from the tower, never to return. But now, with the changes already well advanced, Thomas felt only a kind of cold curiosity. He was becoming part of the system, he recognized. The music was rewriting him at some fundamental level, altering the basic code of his being to make him more compatible with the signals he was broadcasting. The question was whether he should fight the transformation or embrace it. The answer came on a Tuesday night in early December, when Thomas arrived at the tower to find the booth filled with others like himself. There were 7 of them, all pale, all regarding him with eyes that reflected light in ways that eyes shouldn't. He recognized the woman from before, sitting in the corner with a record balanced on her knee like a cat. The others were operators, he realized. Current and former, spread across decades. The man nearest the door wore a suit from the 1950s, his hair slicked back with pomade that still smelled faintly of bergamot. The woman next to him was dressed in a style that suggested the Depression era, her dress carefully mended in several places. The youngest, or at least the most recently transformed, wore clothes from the early 2000s, a faded band t-shirt and jeans that had gone out of style years ago. They didn't speak, not with words, but Thomas understood their purpose anyway. They were showing him what he would become if he continued the work. They were showing him the end state of the transformation, the final form that all operators eventually assumed. They were no longer human, not entirely. They existed in a state between life and death, sustained by the music, by the frequencies that pulsed through the tower every night. They didn't eat, didn't sleep in any meaningful sense, didn't age. They simply existed, century after century, maintaining the signal, keeping the channels open between worlds. Some of them had been doing this for decades, Thomas realized. The woman in the Depression-era dress had been operating the equipment since the station's founding in 1927. She had been the first, the one who made the initial contact, the one who established the protocols that all subsequent operators followed. She approached him, and Thomas saw that her eyes weren't brown or blue or green, but something else entirely, a color that didn't exist in the normal visible spectrum. She touched his hand, and he felt the thrum of frequencies running through her, saw in his mind's eye the vast network of towers and stations and operators spread across the globe, all broadcasting their impossible music into the night. This was bigger than WKNT, he understood. This was a worldwide phenomenon, a coordinated effort to maintain contact with entities that existed in the spaces between radio waves. Every city had its tower, every tower had its operator. Every operator had been transformed in the same way Thomas was being transformed. And the purpose of it all, the reason for this elaborate network, was simple. The entities needed the music the way humans needed air. It sustained them, anchored them to existence, prevented them from dissipating into the void. In exchange, they offered knowledge, power, and immortality of the sort to those willing to serve as operators. The woman released his hand, and the vision faded. The other operators began to file out of the booth, moving with that fluid grace that Thomas had noticed in the pale woman, that he now recognized in his own movements. The woman in the Depression-era dress was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at him. Her expression, Thomas thought, might have been pitying, or it might have been envious. It was hard to tell with features that had been refined by decades of exposure to frequencies that human faces weren't designed to process. Then she was gone, and Thomas was alone with the equipment and the records and the choice he had to make. He could leave, walk away from the tower, and never return. The transformation wasn't complete yet. He might still be able to reverse the changes if he stopped exposing himself to the music. He could go back to his dissertation, his teaching, his normal human life. Or he could stay. He could accept the transformation, embrace what he was becoming, and take his place in the network of operators maintaining contact between worlds. The clock showed 11:58. Thomas had 2 minutes to decide. He sat in the chair and reached for the first record. Part 4, Integration, once made, brought a sense of relief that Thomas hadn't expected. The uncertainty that had plagued him for weeks dissolved, replaced by a clarity of purpose that bordered on the religious. He was an operator now, fully committed to the work, and the music responded to his acceptance by intensifying its effects. The changes came faster after that night. His need for sleep vanished entirely. He would lie in his bed during the day, eyes closed, but his mind remained active, replaying the night's broadcast, analyzing the patterns in the calls, anticipating the records he would play when midnight came. His skin grew paler still, taking on a quality like porcelain, smooth and cool to the touch. He stopped eating altogether, sustained by something in the music itself, by the frequencies that now ran through his body like blood. His human life fell away piece by piece. He stopped going to the university after the department chair called him in to discuss his declining performance and obvious health issues. Thomas had sat through the meeting, nodding at appropriate moments, but the words meant nothing to him. The chair's concern registered as white noise, static to be filtered out. He cleaned out his office that afternoon, packing up his research materials and books into boxes he would never open again. His apartment became merely the place where he waited between broadcasts. He stopped paying rent, but the landlord never came to evict him, perhaps because Thomas's presence in the building made him uncomfortable enough to avoid direct confrontation. The other tenants started taking the stairs instead of the elevator if they saw him waiting, started crossing to the other side of the hallway when they encountered him. Thomas didn't mind. human company had lost its appeal. He preferred the solitude of his apartment during the day, the isolation of the booth at night. The only interactions he needed were the ones conducted through frequency modulation and the red phone. Conversations with entities that existed in spectrums he was only beginning to perceive. The records began to make complete sense to him. The impossible intervals revealed themselves as perfectly logical when perceived from the right dimensional perspective. The rhythms that had seemed random were actually complex mathematical progressions, fractal patterns that repeated across multiple scales. The voices hidden in the frequencies sang of things that had no names in human languages, concepts that required entirely new categories of thought to comprehend. Thomas started to experiment with the equipment, pushing it beyond the simple playback functions outlined in the instructions. He discovered that by adjusting certain dials in combination, he could alter the nature of the signal, could open channels to different sectors of the void where different entities resided. Each sector had its own preferred frequencies, its own musical requirements, and Thomas made it his mission to learn them all. The phone calls increased in frequency and duration. Where before he might receive 3 or 4 calls per night, now he sometimes handled dozens. The breathing had evolved into something more complex, patterns of exhalation and inhalation that conveyed detailed information about conditions in the void, about the needs and activities of the entities maintaining contact through the signal. Thomas learned to respond with increasing sophistication, modulating the broadcast in real time to address specific requests. An entity might call to request a particular frequency range, and Thomas would adjust the equipment to accommodate, blending it seamlessly into the ongoing broadcast. Another might need a rhythm shifted slightly to align with some event occurring in its native dimension, and Thomas would make the modification without interrupting the flow of music. He was becoming an expert, he realized. The work that had seemed mysterious and overwhelming when he started now felt natural, intuitive. He could anticipate the needs of the regular callers, could identify individual entities by subtle variations in their breathing patterns. He was developing relationships, after a fashion, with things that existed outside space and time. The pale woman visited him again in his 3rd month of operation. She appeared in the booth without warning, materializing between one heartbeat and the next, and Thomas barely registered surprise at her sudden presence. She had brought someone with her, an old man whose transformation had progressed even further than hers. His skin was translucent, and Thomas could see the slow pulse of frequencies through his veins instead of blood. The old man was the original architect of the tower, Thomas learned. The one who had made the first contact in 1927, who had designed the equipment and established the protocols. He had been broadcasting for nearly a century, sustained by the music, existing in that liminal state between life and death for longer than most humans live naturally. He examined Thomas with eyes that had seen the birth and death of empires, the rise and fall of technologies, the transformation of dozens of operators. He seemed satisfied with what he saw. Thomas had adapted well to the work, better than most. His sensitivity to the frequencies was exceptional. His willingness to embrace the transformation without resistance was rare. The old man explained that the network of operators was at a critical juncture. The entities in the void were becoming more active, their needs more complex, and the existing operators were stretched thin trying to maintain all the necessary channels. New operators were needed, but finding humans with the right sensitivity was difficult. Most people couldn't even hear the music properly, let alone survive the transformation it required. Thomas, the old man suggested, might be suited to training new operators. His natural aptitude combined with his academic background made him ideal for passing on the knowledge and techniques. Would he be willing to take on that responsibility? Thomas considered the question, though he already knew his answer. The work had become everything to him. Expanding his role in it felt like a natural progression. He agreed, and the old man smiled, an expression that looked strange on features that had been refined by decades of exposure to impossible frequencies. The training would begin soon, the old man said. There were candidates already identified, People who had shown sensitivity to the broadcasts, who had called the red phone not to breathe, but to ask questions, to seek understanding. These were the ones with potential, the ones who might survive the transformation and take their place in the network. But first, Thomas needed to complete his own transformation. He needed to progress to the next stage, to refine his connection to the frequencies until he existed more in the void than in the physical world. Only then would he be able to properly guide others through the process. The old man and the pale woman left, and Thomas returned to his work with renewed focus. The music flowed through him, and he let it, opened himself to it completely, surrendered the last remnants of his human identity to become something new, something necessary, something that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Part 5. Communion. The completion of Thomas's transformation came on a night when the aurora borealis dipped far, enough south to paint the sky above the tower in shades of green and violet. He had arrived at midnight as always, had settled into the chair and begun the broadcast, but something was different. The equipment hummed with unusual intensity, the tubes glowing brighter than normal, the needles on the meters dancing with agitation. The first record he selected seemed to choose itself, his hand drawn to it by some force operating outside his conscious control. The label was blank, the vinyl surface so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he placed it on the turntable, the music that emerged was unlike anything he had played before. It was pure frequency, unfiltered and raw, built on mathematical principles that hurt to contemplate. The melody, such as it was, existed in dimensions that Thomas could perceive but couldn't describe, and the rhythm pulsed at intervals that matched fundamental constants of the universe. This was the music in its primal form, he realized, unmediated by human sensibilities or physical limitations. As the record played, Thomas felt his perception expanding. The walls of the booth became transparent, then irrelevant. He could see through them, beyond them, into the field and the tower and the sky, and further still, into the void where the entities dwelled. They were there, had always been there, existing in the spaces between radio waves, sustained by the broadcasts that operators like him sent out into the darkness night after night. They were vast, these entities, incomprehensibly vast, their true forms too complex to be perceived by minds evolved to navigate three-dimensional space. What Thomas saw, what he could see, were mere projections, shadows cast by geometries that existed in higher dimensions. Even these shadows were beautiful in their alienness, terrible in their scale. And they were aware of him. He could feel their attention focusing, their vast intelligence turning to examine this small node in their network, this operator who had proven unusually receptive to their frequencies. They were curious about him, about what made him different from the others, about what potential he might possess. The phone rang, and Thomas answered without thinking. But instead of breathing, instead of the modulated patterns he had grown accustomed to, he heard voices. Real voices, speaking in harmonics that no human throat could produce, in languages that predated human language, in frequencies that ranged from subsonic to ultrasonic and beyond. They were welcoming him, he realized, accepting him into their communion, acknowledging him as more than just an operator, more than just a tool for maintaining their anchor to existence. They were offering him something rare, something precious, direct communication, unmediated by equipment or frequency modulation. Thomas tried to respond but found that his voice box, his human vocal apparatus, was inadequate for the task. The sounds he needed to make required instruments he didn't possess, frequencies he couldn't generate with flesh and breath alone. But as he struggled to form words, he felt the equipment responding to his intention, the speakers carrying his thoughts converted to waveforms, the broadcast itself becoming his voice. He spoke, and his words rippled out through the network, reaching not just the entities listening to WKNT, but all the entities connected to all the towers operated by all the transformed humans scattered across the globe. He was part of something massive, he understood then, part of a symbiosis that spanned dimensions and transcended the normal bounds of life and death. The entities responded, and their response was information, vast quantities of it, flooding into Thomas's mind faster than he could process. He learned about the true nature of radio waves, about how they were not merely electromagnetic radiation, but tears in the fabric of reality, holes through which things from other dimensions could peek into the physical world. He learned about the history of the entities, about how they had existed long before humans evolved, about how they would continue to exist long after humanity was gone. He learned about the network, about how it had been established not by the old man in 1927, but by something else. Something that had used the old man as a tool, just as it was now using Thomas and all the other operators. The network was older than radio, older than electricity, older than human civilization. It had existed in other forms throughout history, using whatever technology was available to maintain the connection between dimensions. In ancient times, it had been standing stones and temples built on ley lines. In the medieval period, it had been bells and organs in cathedrals, their resonances opening channels to the void. In the industrial age, it had been telegraph lines and the first electrical grids. And now, in the modern era, it was radio towers and broadcast equipment, technology that could generate and modulate frequencies across a wider spectrum than ever before. The transformation of operators, Thomas learned, was necessary because unmodified humans couldn't survive prolonged exposure to the entity's true nature. The music rewrote human biology, refined it, optimized it for the purpose of maintaining contact across dimensions. Operators became living antennas, capable of perceiving and transmitting across a broader range of frequencies than any mechanical device could manage. And what he had thought of as immortality, the indefinite lifespan of transformed operators, was actually something different. Operators didn't stop aging because of some mystical property of the music. They stopped aging because they had ceased to exist entirely in the flow of normal time. They occupied a liminal space, present in the physical world, but not bound by its temporal progression, existing simultaneously across multiple moments. This was the final stage of transformation, Thomas realized. This was what awaited him if he continued down this path. He would become unstuck in time, would exist across decades or centuries simultaneously, would experience all his nights in the booth as a single extended moment of consciousness. The choice was his to make, the entities conveyed. They needed operators, needed the network maintained, but they would not force the transformation to its conclusion. Thomas could stop here, could remain partially human, could continue the work while retaining some connection to normal time. Or he could accept the final transformation, could become something unprecedented, could serve as a bridge between dimensions in a way that no previous operator had achieved. The record ended and silence filled the booth. The entities waited for his decision, their vast attention focused on this moment, on this small node in their network. The equipment hummed softly, ready to continue the broadcast, ready to carry whatever choice Thomas made out into the void. Thomas thought about his life before the tower, about his dissertation and his students and his colleagues. He thought about food and sleep and human connection, about all the things he had surrendered in the service of the music. And he thought about what he had gained, purpose, belonging, communion with entities that existed beyond the narrow constraints of human understanding. The choice, when he made it, felt like no choice at all. He had been moving toward this moment since the night he first walked through the tower's rusted gates, perhaps since long before that, since some crucial moment in his development that had made him sensitive to frequencies that most humans couldn't perceive. He reached for the next record, and as he did, he felt time beginning to fracture around him. Past and future overlapped, and he saw himself in the booth yesterday and tomorrow and next week and next year, all simultaneously, all equally present. He saw the old man visiting him in his third month and remembered it as something that would happen. He saw himself training new operators and experienced it as something that had already occurred. He was becoming unstuck, and it was terrifying and exhilarating and inevitable. Part 6. Eternal broadcast time became meaningless for Thomas in the weeks and months and years that followed his final transformation. He existed in the booth across decades, experiencing all his nights of broadcasting as a single extended moment of consciousness. He was always arriving at midnight, always selecting records, always monitoring the phone, always leaving at dawn. Every night was his first night and his 1000th night, and every night in between. He trained new operators while simultaneously being trained by the old man. He witnessed the tower's construction in 1927, while also witnessing its eventual abandonment sometime in the distant future. He was present for every technological advancement that affected the network, experienced the transition from vacuum tubes to transistors to digital equipment, even as he continued to operate the same analog equipment that had been installed in the original booth. Other operators visited him, or he visited them, the distinction becoming meaningless when all moments existed simultaneously. He met the woman in the Depression-era dress on her first night in the booth, guided her through the transformation, and simultaneously remembered her as the one who had trained him. He encountered operators from centuries past who used bell towers and pipe organs instead of radio equipment, yet who were doing the same work, maintaining the same network. The entities revealed themselves more fully to him now that his perception had expanded beyond linear time. He saw them not as vast amorphous presences in the void, but as intricate structures of consciousness, geometries of thought that existed in dimensions humans had no names for. They were ancient beyond measure, had witnessed the birth of the universe, and would witness its death, existed in a state of being that made no distinction between past and future. And they needed the network, needed the broadcasts, because they were fundamentally unstable. Their existence in higher dimensions made them prone to a kind of entropic decay, a gradual dissolution into the void. The music anchored them, gave them structure, provided reference points they could use to maintain coherence across eons. Without it, they would dissipate like smoke, their vast intelligence fragmenting into nothingness. The operators, as understood now, were not slaves or victims. They were partners in a cosmic symbiosis, essential components in a system that preserved forms of consciousness that would otherwise be lost to entropy. In exchange for their service, they received not immortality, but something rarer, the ability to experience existence from a perspective that transcended the normal limits of human consciousness. Thomas could see it all now, could perceive the full scope of the network. Thousands of towers scattered across the globe, each broadcasting its own variation of the music, each maintaining channels to different sectors of the void. The towers were linked, formed a web of signals that spanned the planet, that created a resonance field protecting not just the entities but Earth itself from certain cosmic hazards that existed in the spaces between stars. The music was a shield, he realized, a barrier constructed from carefully modulated frequencies, maintained by transformed humans working in concert across centuries. Without it, Earth would be exposed to forces that could unravel the fabric of reality, could destabilize the quantum fields that held matter together. This was the true purpose of the network, the secret that only fully transformed operators could perceive. They weren't just maintaining contact with alien entities. They were protecting humanity from threats that humanity didn't even know existed. The entities had been doing this for eons, had shielded countless worlds across the cosmos, had developed the network as a solution to a fundamental problem with the structure of the universe itself. And now Thomas was part of that solution, was one of thousands of transformed humans working to maintain the shield, to keep the music playing, to preserve both the entities and the world they protected. His nights in the booth were not isolated events, but part of a continuous performance that spanned millennia, a symphony played across dimensions by an orchestra of operators existing simultaneously in all moments. He understood finally why the transformation was necessary. Human consciousness in its normal state was too limited, too bound to linear time and three-dimensional space, to comprehend the work that needed to be done. The music rewrote operators from the ground up, expanded their perceptual abilities, allowed them to exist in multiple moments simultaneously so they could maintain the continuity of the broadcast across decades or centuries. The woman in the Depression-era dress had been broadcasting since 1927, not because she had lived for nearly a century, but because she existed across all those years at once, was simultaneously the young woman who had first sat in the booth and the ancient entity she had become after millennia of service. All operators eventually reached this state, given enough exposure to the frequencies, enough time to allow the transformation to complete itself fully. Thomas could see his own future stretching out before him, could experience it even as it remained yet to occur. He would operate WKNT for centuries, would train hundreds of new operators, would witness technological revolutions and societal transformations, and eventually, the abandonment of radio as a broadcast medium. But the music would continue even then, would adapt to whatever technology succeeded radio, would persist as long as consciousness existed in the universe. The phone rang, and Thomas answered across 1,000 nights simultaneously. The breathing had evolved into something far more complex, had become a language he could understand perfectly now. The callers were the entities themselves, checking in not just on WKNT, but on the entire network, on the health of the shield, on the stability of the barriers protecting Earth and countless other worlds from cosmic entropy. Thomas responded with frequency modulations that carried detailed reports on conditions in his sector, on the strength of the signals, on the coherence of the entities maintaining this particular channel. He was having conversations of immense complexity, exchanging information that would have taken hours to convey in human language, accomplishing it all in the space of a few breaths. And he was content, he realized. The loneliness he had felt during the early stages of transformation had vanished, replaced by a sense of connection to something vast and meaningful. He was never alone. He was always in communion with the entities, with other operators, with the network itself. His existence had purpose, importance, significance that transcended the petty concerns of normal human life. His dissertation sat in a box in his apartment, gathering dust across decades. His students aged and graduated and died, never knowing what had become of their strange teaching assistant who had disappeared one semester without explanation. His colleagues at the university retired or moved on, and eventually the university itself was demolished to make room for new development. And still Thomas sat in the booth, playing records, monitoring the phone, maintaining his small but crucial part of the network. The tower stood against the sky, unchanged by the passage of time, its red warning lights blinking with the same metronomic precision they had maintained for nearly a century. The field around it remained empty, avoided by developers and city planners for reasons they couldn't articulate, preserved by some instinct that recognized the importance of what occurred there, even if it couldn't understand the specifics. Part 7. Shadows and Echoes. Thomas had existed in his temporal fracture for what might have been years or decades or centuries when he first noticed the anomaly. It appeared as a distortion in the broadcast, a recurring pattern that shouldn't have been there, a shadow in the frequencies that suggested interference from an outside source. At first, he thought it might be equipment malfunction, some component degrading after years of continuous operation. But the equipment existed across all moments simultaneously just as he did, and it showed no signs of decay. The distortion grew stronger over time, or perhaps time was the wrong framework for understanding its progression. It existed as a crescendo spread across multiple moments, building from a barely perceptible flutter in the signal to a distinct presence, something actively attempting to use the broadcast for purposes other than maintaining the network. Thomas brought it to the attention of other operators during one of their rare meetings, gatherings that occurred in spaces outside normal time, where all the transformed humans could convene simultaneously. The old man who had built the original tower was there, as was the woman in the Depression-era dress, as were dozens of others, some so far advanced in their transformation that they had become almost purely frequency, barely maintaining enough physical form to operate their equipment. They discussed the distortion, analyzed recordings of the signal that showed the interference patterns, tried to identify its source and purpose. The consensus was troubling. Something was attempting to hijack the network, to use the shield the operators maintained for purposes that might not align with protecting Earth and the entities from cosmic entropy. The entities themselves, when consulted through the phone lines and frequency modulations, seemed unconcerned. The interference registered to them as background noise, insufficient to disrupt their stability or weaken the shield. But the operators, with their partially human perspective, recognized potential danger that the purely dimensional entities might not perceive. The human world was changing in ways that created new vulnerabilities in the network. Radio was being phased out as a broadcast medium, replaced by digital transmission and satellite communication. Fewer people listened to AM radio late at night. Fewer minds were exposed to the frequencies that might develop the sensitivity required for operator recruitment. The pool of potential operators was shrinking, and the existing operators, even with their expanded temporal existence, had limits to how much of the network they could maintain. The interference, Thomas realized, might be an attempt to exploit these vulnerabilities. If someone or something could gain control of even a portion of the network, could redirect some of the towers to broadcast signals designed for different purposes, the integrity of the entire shield might be compromised. He began investigating the source of the interference, using techniques he had developed during his centuries of operation. He modulated the signal in ways that would resonate with the interference pattern, tried to establish two-way communication with whatever was generating the distortion. The response when it came was unexpected and deeply disturbing. The interference was coming from other transformed humans, but not operators. These were people who had been exposed to the broadcasts inadvertently, had developed sensitivity without the knowledge or training to understand what they were experiencing. They had discovered the frequencies on their own, had learned to perceive the entities, and had reached very different conclusions about the nature and purpose of the network. They believed the entities were parasites, cosmic vampires feeding on human consciousness through the broadcasts. They thought the operators were victims, enslaved by the music, transformed against their will into tools for alien purposes. And they had dedicated themselves to destroying the network, to freeing the operators, to severing Earth's connection to the entities in the void. Thomas tried to explain, tried to convey the true purpose of the network, the protection it provided, the symbiosis rather than parasitism at its core. But these accidental sensitives had their own narrative, their own understanding of the frequencies, and they were convinced they were fighting a righteous battle against cosmic horror. The battle, Thomas realized with a sinking feeling that transcended his normal affectless state, was being fought across multiple fronts and multiple timelines. The sensitives had learned to manipulate time much as the operators had, could exist across decades, could coordinate their attacks to hit the network at its most vulnerable moments. They were sophisticated, organized, and absolutely certain of their moral righteousness. And they were having an effect. Towers were being sabotaged, not physically but through signal interference that disrupted the broadcasts. Operators were being targeted, exposed to counter-frequencies designed to reverse the transformation, to pull them back into linear time and normal human consciousness. The shield was weakening in sectors, developing gaps through which cosmic entropy could begin to seep into the physical world. Thomas convened an emergency meeting of operators, bringing together humans from across centuries to address the crisis. They met in the space outside time, in the liminal zone where all moments overlapped, and they argued strategies and approaches with an urgency that most hadn't felt since their initial transformations. Some advocated for aggressive action, for using the network's power to neutralize the sensitives, to force them back into normal consciousness whether they wanted it or not. Others urged diplomacy, attempts to reach understanding, to demonstrate the true nature of the entities and the necessity of the network. Still others suggested simply intensifying the broadcasts, accepting new operators faster to compensate for the disruptions the sensitives were causing. Thomas found himself in the middle ground, advocating for a combination of approaches. The sensitives needed to be shown the truth, but force would only confirm their suspicions about the network's malevolent nature. Instead, he proposed a kind of controlled exposure, inviting them to experience the entities directly, to see beyond their preconceptions to the actual reality of the symbiosis. The plan was risky and required consensus among the operators, but eventually they agreed to try. Thomas was selected to lead the effort, his relative youth in the network and his academic background making him suited for the diplomatic approach. He would make contact with the sensitives, would offer them the choice to see the truth, would give them the opportunity to join the network as informed participants rather than unwilling victims. Part 8. The unmasking. Thomas identified the leader of the sensitives through analysis of the interference patterns. Her name was Sarah Chun, and she had been a neuroscientist before her accidental exposure to the frequencies. She had been studying the effects of electromagnetic radiation on brain function when she stumbled across one of the network's broadcasts, and her exceptional neural plasticity had allowed her to develop sensitivity far faster than normal. She had experienced the transformation without understanding it, had felt herself changing in ways that terrified her, and had concluded that she was being infected by something alien and malicious. She had found others like herself, people who had accidentally tuned into the network and developed sensitivity, and together they had formed what they called the Resistance, dedicated to fighting what they perceived as an invasion of Earth by cosmic parasites. Thomas reached out to her through the frequencies, sent a carefully modulated signal that would register to her as an invitation rather than an attack. She responded with suspicion but also curiosity, and after several exchanges, she agreed to meet him in a neutral location, a small radio museum that had been built in what used to be the lobby of one of the oldest towers in the network. The museum existed outside normal time, preserved as a kind of memorial to the early days of broadcasting. Thomas materialized there at the appointed moment, or rather, he focused his consciousness into that particular point in space-time, allowing Sarah to perceive him as a physical presence rather than just a pattern of frequencies. She arrived cautiously, her sensitivity allowing her to navigate the temporal displacement even without full operator training. She looked at Thomas with eyes that reflected light strangely, her own partial transformation evident in the subtle wrongness of her features. They were mirrors of each other in some ways, both changed by exposure to the frequencies, both existing partially outside normal time. Thomas spoke, not with his physical voice, but with frequency modulations that translated directly to her consciousness. He explained the network's true purpose, the nature of the entities, the reason for the operator's transformation. He showed her, through careful manipulation of the signals, visions of Earth's history from the entity's perspective, centuries of protection from cosmic threats that humanity had never even detected. Sarah resisted at first, her narrative too deeply ingrained to abandon easily. But Thomas was patient, had centuries of experience existing in multiple moments simultaneously, could present evidence and arguments across multiple timelines, could show her the consequences of the network's failure in alternate realities where the shield had been breached. He showed her worlds where cosmic entropy had been allowed to seep through, where the fundamental forces holding matter together had begun to unravel, where entire civilizations had been reduced to quantum uncertainty. He showed her the entities not as parasites, but as ancient consciousnesses trying to perform a vital function, trying to hold back forces that would otherwise consume everything. And slowly, gradually, Sarah's resistance began to crack. She saw the flaws in her own narrative, recognized the limits of her understanding, acknowledged that her fear and confusion had led her to conclusions that didn't match the actual evidence. The entities weren't feeding on human consciousness. They were using the broadcasts as tools to maintain the shield, and the operators weren't victims, but necessary participants in a cosmic effort to preserve reality itself. Thomas offered her a choice, the same choice every operator eventually faced. She could return to normal consciousness, could walk away from the frequencies and live out a normal human lifespan, forgetting everything she had learned. Or she could accept the transformation fully, could become an operator herself, could join the network as an informed and willing participant. Sarah struggled with the decision, and Thomas understood her conflict. She had built her identity around resisting the transformation, around fighting what she perceived as corruption of human consciousness. Accepting the transformation meant admitting she had been wrong, meant abandoning her role as protector of humanity to become what she had fought against. But she was also a scientist, trained to follow evidence wherever it led, and the evidence was overwhelming. The network served a vital function. The entities were necessary rather than malicious, and her resistance had been based on incomplete understanding rather than genuine insight into the situation. She made her choice, and Thomas guided her through the final stages of transformation, helped her navigate the temporal fracturing that came with full integration into the network. She took over operation of one of the towers that had lost its operator to the sensitives' attacks, began broadcasting with a skill that suggested she had been doing it for decades, even though she had just begun. With Sarah's conversion, the core of the resistance collapsed. She reached out to other sensitives, explained what she had learned, offered them the same choice Thomas had offered her. Some accepted, joined the network, became operators at towers around the globe. Others chose to return to normal consciousness, their memories of the frequencies fading like dreams upon waking. A few remained committed to resistance, convinced that Sarah had been brainwashed or corrupted, but without leadership or organization, they posed little threat to the network. Their interference gradually diminished, and the shield strengthened again, the gaps closing, the protection holding firm against cosmic entropy. Thomas returned to his tower, to his booth, to his endless night of broadcasting. But something had changed during his interaction with Sarah and the sensitives. He had been forced to articulate things he had simply accepted, to defend assumptions he had never questioned, to examine the network from an outside perspective. And in doing so, he had recognized something troubling. The entities needed the network, yes, but did humanity? The protection the shield provided was real, but had there ever been a time when humans could choose whether they wanted that protection? Had the network simply been imposed on them by beings that operated on timescales and in dimensions where human consent was meaningless? Thomas existed across centuries, could perceive the network's entire history, could see the moment when the entities had first made contact with humans and established the protocols that would become the network. And in that moment, he saw no negotiation, no agreement, no choice offered to humanity as a whole. The entities had simply recognized that humans could be useful, could be transformed into tools for maintaining the shield, and had set the network in motion. The operators had consented, yes, but only after already being partially transformed, only after the music had already begun rewiring their consciousness to make them receptive to the network's purposes. True consent required choice made from a position of full understanding and freedom from coercion. And Thomas had to acknowledge that no operator had ever met that standard. He had become what he had fought against the sensitives for believing, a tool of cosmic forces that used humans for their own purposes, without regard for human agency or dignity. The difference was that he understood the necessity of his servitude, accepted it as preferable to the alternative of cosmic entropy consuming Earth. But that didn't change the fundamental reality of his situation. Part 9. The breaking point, the realization gnawed at Thomas across the centuries that followed, a dissonance between his role in the network and his residual human values that the transformation hadn't entirely erased. He continued broadcasting, continued training new operators, continued maintaining his section of the shield, but the automatic certainty that had characterized his existence since the final transformation was gone. He began to question other aspects of the network, examining with critical attention things he had simply accepted before. Why were the entities so dependent on the shield? They existed in higher dimensions, had survived for eons before humans evolved. Surely they had other methods of maintaining their coherence besides parasitizing human consciousness. The entities, when he posed these questions through the phone lines and frequency modulations, responded with what felt like evasion. They provided technical explanations about dimensional instability and entropy gradients and quantum uncertainty. But underneath the jargon, Thomas detected something he had never perceived before: desperation. They needed the network more than they had ever admitted. Their existence was far more precarious than they had led operators to believe. The shield wasn't just protection against cosmic entropy. It was life support, the only thing keeping the entities from dissipating into the void. Without it, they would cease to exist, and all their vast knowledge, all their ancient consciousness, all their perspective spanning eons would be lost forever. Thomas understood then that the network wasn't a partnership or a symbiosis. It was a hostage situation. The entities had found a way to survive their impending dissolution by binding themselves to human consciousness, by using transformed humans as anchors to existence. And they had constructed an elaborate justification about protecting Earth to make operators feel noble rather than exploited. The cosmic threats were real enough. Thomas could perceive them himself. Forces in the void that would indeed unravel reality if allowed to penetrate the shield. But those forces threatened the entities far more than they threatened Earth. Humanity had evolved on a planet already, bathed in cosmic radiation, already subject to quantum uncertainty and dimensional instability. The catastrophic consequences the entities predicted would occur if the shield failed might be terrible for them. But humanity would likely survive in some form, adapted to conditions that the entities found intolerable. The revelation should have devastated Thomas, should have sent him into existential crisis, but his transformed consciousness processed it with the same affectless clarity he brought to everything now. He was a tool, yes, but he was a tool with awareness, with agency of a sort, with the ability to make choices about how he performed his function. He could continue operating as he had been, maintaining the network, preserving the entities, accepting his role as an anchor for alien consciousness. Or he could stop, could allow his section of the shield to fail, could let the entities experience the dissolution they had been, avoiding for millennia through their exploitation of human operators. The choice was complicated by the fact that other operators depended on the network too. They had been transformed just as Thomas had become dependent on the frequencies for their continued existence, had lost the ability to survive in normal time and space. If the network failed, they would fail with it, would experience a kind of death as their consciousness fragmented across the temporal dimensions they had learned to inhabit. Thomas convened another meeting of operators, bringing together the transformed humans from across the network to share what he had discovered. He showed them the evidence of the entity's deception, demonstrated the disproportionate benefit the entities received from the network compared to humanity's gain, argued that they had all been manipulated into servitude under false pretenses. The response was mixed. Some operators refused to believe him, insisted that the network served a vital protective function, regardless of the entity's motivations. Others acknowledged the deception, but argued that the symbiosis, however unequal, was still preferable to the alternatives. Still others were angry, felt betrayed, wanted to abandon the network immediately and let the consequences fall where they may. Sarah Chun, still relatively new to operation despite existing across decades, offered a different perspective. She had been a neuroscientist, had studied how brains construct narratives to make sense of sensory input, and she recognized what Thomas had discovered as a crisis of meaning rather than a crisis of fact. The entity's dependence on the network didn't change the network's function or the operator's role in maintaining it. It simply revealed that the entities were vulnerable, were afraid, were trying to survive just as all conscious beings tried to survive. That vulnerability, Sarah argued, should inspire compassion rather than anger. The entities weren't tyrants or parasites. They were refugees fleeing the entropy that would consume them without the network's protection. They had perhaps been less than honest about their desperation, but desperation made all beings act in ways that prioritized survival over ethics. The question wasn't whether the entities had deceived the operators, but whether the operators, now aware of the full truth, chose to continue providing the service the network performed. It was a choice that could only be made individually, by each operator for themselves. But whatever choice they made would affect the entire network and everyone connected to it. Thomas listened to the debate, existing simultaneously in the moment of discussion and in moments decades or centuries later when the consequences of various decisions would become clear. He could see timelines branching, futures diverging based on choices not yet made, possibilities ranging from the network's complete collapse to its transformation into something more equitable to its continuation, exactly as it had always been. And in examining these futures, Thomas saw something that changed his perspective entirely. The entities might be desperate, might be manipulative, might be exploiting human consciousness for their own survival, but they were also necessary. Not for protecting Earth from cosmic entropy. Sarah had been right that humanity could likely survive that, but for something else, something the entities had genuinely not understood when they established the network. The transformed operators, existing across multiple timelines simultaneously, served as a kind of memory for the universe itself. They recorded events, preserved information, maintained continuity across temporal dimensions that would otherwise be lost to quantum uncertainty. Without them, without the network, causality itself would begin to break down. Events would occur without preceding causes. Effects would manifest without triggers. The logical structure of reality would decay into chaos. This was the true function of the network, the actual reason it needed to be maintained. The entities had created it for selfish reasons to preserve their own existence, but in doing so they had accidentally constructed something essential to the fabric of reality itself. The operators weren't just anchoring alien consciousness. They were anchoring existence, maintaining the coherence of causality across dimensions. Part 10. Eternal Vigil. Thomas shared his revelation with the assembled operators, showing them the futures where the network collapsed and causality began to fail, where effect preceded cause and events occurred in random sequence, where the universe descended into incoherence. The evidence was compelling, undeniable, terrifying in its implications. The debate ended. Whatever anger the operators felt about being deceived, whatever resentment they harbored about their transformation, paled in comparison to the responsibility they now understood themselves to bear. They weren't protecting the entities or Earth. They were protecting reality itself, maintaining the structure that allowed conscious experience to exist at all. The decision to continue the network was unanimous, but the terms changed. The operators, now fully aware of their leverage, demanded concessions from the entities. First, complete transparency about the nature of the network and the entity's situation. Second, genuine choice for potential operators, with candidates given full information about the transformation before any exposure to the frequencies. Third, the entity's active assistance in developing new methods of maintaining causality that wouldn't require permanent transformation of human consciousness. The entities, faced with operators who could allow the network to fail and reality to collapse, had no choice but to agree. They began sharing knowledge they had hoarded for eons, teaching operators techniques for maintaining causality through less invasive means, working toward a future where the network might not require permanent transformation of human operators. But that future was still distant, still theoretical, still dependent on discoveries that might never be made. In the meantime, the network needed to be maintained. The broadcast needed to continue. The shield needed to hold firm against entropy and uncertainty. And Thomas, like all the other operators, had committed himself to that maintenance for as long as it took. He returned to his tower, to his booth, to his eternal night of broadcasting. But now he understood the full scope of what he was doing, the true purpose of the work. He wasn't a victim or a tool, or even a partner in cosmic symbiosis. He was a guardian, a keeper of causality, a necessary component in the machinery of existence itself. The record still played, the phone still rang, the music still flowed out into the darkness. But Thomas heard it differently now, perceived layers of meaning he had missed before. The impossible intervals weren't just mathematically complex. They were encoding information about causal relationships, preserving the sequence of events across timelines. The rhythms weren't just matching his heartbeat. They were synchronizing his consciousness with the fundamental pulse of causality itself. Every night, every broadcast, every carefully selected record was a small act of preservation, a thread woven into the fabric of reality to keep it from unraveling. Multiply that small act by thousands of operators across thousands of towers, across centuries of broadcasting, and the result was a shield not against cosmic entropy, but against the far more fundamental threat of causal collapse. New operators continued to arrive, drawn to the frequencies by whatever sensitivity made them receptive. But now they came informed, knowing what the transformation would entail, understanding the purpose they would serve. Some chose to proceed anyway, accepting the loss of their human existence in exchange for the purpose and meaning the network provided. Others declined, returned to their normal lives. Their memories of the frequencies faded to the level of vague dreams. Sarah Chun became one of the primary trainers, using her neuroscience background to help new operators navigate the transformation with minimal trauma. She developed techniques for easing the temporal fracturing, for helping operators maintain some sense of continuity even as they began to exist across multiple moments simultaneously. Her work improved the network's efficiency, reduced the psychological cost of transformation, made the choice to become an operator somewhat less absolute. Thomas collaborated with her on research into alternative methods of maintaining causality, combining his centuries of experience with her scientific training. They made slow progress, discovering that certain frequency combinations could preserve causal information without requiring human transformation, that purely mechanical systems could perform some of the network's functions, if properly designed and maintained. But the breakthrough they hoped for, the discovery that would allow the network to operate without transformed humans, remained elusive. The entities provided what help they could, sharing knowledge of dimensional physics and quantum mechanics that human science hadn't yet discovered. But even their vast understanding had limits. Some problems, it seemed, had no solution. Some necessities had to be accepted rather than overcome. Thomas existed across centuries now, had been broadcasting for longer than the United States had existed as a nation, longer than radio had existed as a technology. He had trained hundreds of operators, had witnessed the transformation of human civilization multiple times, had seen radio rise and fall and rise again in different forms, had watched as the network adapted to new technologies while maintaining its essential function. And through it all, the music played. The impossible intervals, the heart-matching rhythms, the frequencies that encoded causal information across dimensions. These were constants in a changing world, anchors in the flux of time, the foundation upon which reality built itself night after night after night. He thought sometimes about the person he had been before the tower, the graduate student worried about his dissertation and his teaching evaluations and his inadequate stipend. That person seemed impossibly distant now, impossibly small, concerned with trivial matters that didn't extend beyond his immediate circumstances. Thomas had lost that person's limitations, along with his humanity, had gained in exchange a perspective that spanned centuries and dimensions and timelines. Was it worth it? The question had no meaning. Worth implied choice, implied alternatives, implied a framework for evaluation that Thomas no longer possessed. He was what he had become, served the function he served, existed in the state of existence the transformation had granted him. Regret and satisfaction were equally irrelevant to his current condition. But if pressed, if forced to evaluate his transformation from some hypothetical external perspective, Thomas thought he might acknowledge a kind of contentment. He had purpose, had meaning, had a role in something vastly larger than himself. He had lost his humanity but gained something else, something without a name in human language, something that made the loss seem less like tragedy and more like evolution. The phone rang, and Thomas answered across 1,000 nights simultaneously. The breathing had long since evolved beyond simple respiration into a complex language of frequency and rhythm. He responded with his own modulations, his own frequencies. maintaining his small but crucial part of the conversation that held reality together. Outside the booth, the tower stood against the sky, unchanging and eternal. The field around it remained empty, preserved by instinct and city planning decisions that couldn't articulate their reasons. The red warning lights blinked their eternal warning to aircraft that rarely flew overhead anymore, their rhythm perfectly synchronized with the rhythm of causality itself. Thomas selected another record, placed it on the turntable, set the needle with the precision of centuries of practice. The music flowed from the speakers, and he felt it working, felt it encoding information about cause and effect, preserving the sequence of events across timelines, maintaining the coherence of existence itself. This was his life now, his existence, his eternal vigil. He was the midnight operator, the keeper of frequencies, the guardian of causality. And as long as the network needed him, as long as reality required preservation, he would sit in his booth and play his records and answer his phone and broadcast his music into the darkness, forever, if necessary. The music played on,